"Take it," the man said, sliding a thick envelope across the diner counter. "And forget what you saw. No." The four men behind him went very still. Somewhere in the back, a pan hit the floor, and nobody moved to pick it up. Nora Callahan didn't touch the envelope. She wiped her hands on her apron, the same one she'd worn through 3 years of double shifts, and looked past the man in the gray overcoat toward the booth by the window, the one still holding a coffee cup with lipstick on the rim, and a chair knocked sideways from where its owner had left in a hurry 20 minutes earlier. "I don't need your money," Nora said. "I need you to leave before the police get here." The man's jaw tightened. Behind him, one of the four men shifted his weight, hand drifting toward his jacket, and stopped only because a low voice from the doorway said a single word: "Enough." Every head in the diner turned. A tall man in a dark suit stood in the entrance, rain still beating on his shoulders, watching the whole scene unfold with the particular stillness of someone used to being obeyed before he ever finished a sentence. He was the reason four men had come to a diner at 11 at night. He was also, though nobody in that room knew it yet, about to be turned down by the only person in the city too stubborn to be afraid of him. The trouble had started 40 minutes earlier, when a man named Elias Farrow walked into the diner, soaked to the bone, sat in the corner booth, and ordered coffee he had no intention of drinking. Nora had clocked him as trouble the second he sat down. The way his eyes kept cutting to the door, the way his hands shook just slightly around the cup, the way he flinched every time the bell above the entrance rang. She'd brought him a refill anyway. It was the job. You didn't get to pick which customers looked haunted and which ones didn't. "You need anything else, hon?" she'd asked. "Just a minute," he'd said. "Just give me a minute." He never got one. 2 men in dark coats had come through the door 8 minutes later, and Elias Farrow had bolted for the kitchen exit so fast he'd knocked his chair sideways and left his coffee cup rocking on the table. The 2 men hadn't chased him far. They'd gone as far as the alley door and come back a few minutes later looking irritated but unworried. The particular unworried of men who knew the person they wanted couldn't have gotten far and would be found regardless. That was when the man in the gray overcoat had approached the counter and set the envelope down. "You saw a man come through here," he'd said. "Nervous. Maybe said something to you." "I see a lot of nervous men in here," Nora had answered. "Comes with the job. This one's different, and you're going to forget you ever saw him." That's when the envelope appeared, thick enough that she didn't need to open it to know it was more money than she made in 2 months. That's when she'd said no. The man in the doorway, the one who'd said enough, crossed the diner floor without hurrying. He was younger than Nora expected for someone who could silence a room with a single word, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of composed, unreadable face that made her think of men in old photographs. The ones who'd survived wars nobody talked about anymore. "Put the money away, Marco," he said to the man in the gray overcoat. "Mr. Castiglione, she's stalling." "She knows where he went." I said, "Put it away." Something in his tone made even Marco fold instantly, the envelope disappearing back into his jacket without another word. The man, Castiglione, apparently, though the name meant nothing to Nora beyond the way the whole diner seemed to lean slightly away from it, turned his attention to her fully for the first time. His eyes moved over her, without the particular assessing sweep she was used to from certain kinds of men, the up and down that made her feel like a plate being weighed for its scrap value. He just looked at her face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora, Nora." He tested the syllables like he was filing them away somewhere permanent. "You understand who I am? I understand you've got 4 men and a diner full of scared regulars, and none of that changes my answer." She crossed her arms. "I don't know where your friend went, and even if I did, I wouldn't sell it to you for an envelope of cash, because that man looked like he was running from something a lot worse than a bad debt, and I'm not in the business of helping people like you finish what you started." Somewhere behind him, Marco made a small, strangled sound, the sound of a man who fully expected his boss to do something violent and was bracing for it. Instead, Adriano Castiglione smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't even a calculated one. It was the smile of a man who had spent years surrounded by people who agreed with him reflexively, out of fear or ambition, or both, and had just been told no by a waitress in a diner at 11 o'clock at night, and found, much to his own surprise, that he liked it. "You have no idea who I am," he said, "and you're still telling me no. I have a pretty good idea, Nora said. I've got eyes. Doesn't change my answer. He studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he reached into his own jacket, pulled out a card, plain, cream-colored, nothing printed on it but a phone number, and set it on the counter, next to where Marco's envelope had been a minute earlier. If Pharaoh contacts you, he said, I'd like to know. Not for the reason you think. He paused. He owes me a debt that isn't money, and I intend to collect it without hurting him. But I understand you have no reason to believe that, and I'm not going to ask you to. Then why leave the card? Because I think you're the kind of person who does the right thing regardless of who's asking, Adriano said. And someday that might work in my favor instead of against it. He turned to his men. We're leaving. Nobody touches this diner again. Nobody comes back here uninvited. The 4 men filed out into the rain without another word. Adriano lingered a moment longer at the door, glancing back once at the woman still standing behind the counter with her arms crossed and his card untouched beside the coffee machine. Good night, Nora, he said, and then he was gone, and the diner exhaled all at once, chairs scraping, someone finally picking the dropped pan up off the kitchen floor. The ordinary noise of a place returning slowly to itself. Nora looked down at the card. She didn't throw it away. She told herself that was only because she didn't want to leave fingerprints on anything connected to a man like that, and she almost believed it. That night, after close, Nora sat in her ancient car in the diner's empty lot longer than she needed to, engine running for the heat, staring at nothing in particular. Rick, the owner, had locked up beside her, hands still shaking slightly from the whole ordeal. You know who that was, Rick said. It wasn't a question. I've got a decent guess. Adriano Castiglione runs half the docks and most of what moves through them after dark. My cousin used to work loading crates down there. Man like that doesn't take no for an answer, Nora. You should have just told him what he wanted. Maybe, Nora said. But that scared kid in the corner booth looked like he needed somebody to not sell him out for once in his life. Figured it might as well be me. Rick studied her for a moment. Something between exasperation and reluctant respect crossing his tired face. You're going to get us both killed one of these days. Not tonight, at least. She put the car in reverse. Go home, Rick. Get some sleep. She drove back to her one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where the radiator clanked all winter and the walls were thin enough to hear the couple next door arguing about rent, and she lay awake a long time that night, thinking about a man in a wet coat with his hand shaking around a coffee cup, and another man in a dry one who'd said enough like it was the only word he needed. She thought, too, about her own life these past 3 years. The nursing program she'd dropped out of when her mother got sick, the debts that had piled up in the year it took her mother to die, the diner job that had started as temporary and calcified, slowly, into something that felt permanent, whether she wanted it to be or not. She was 29 years old, carrying more weight than any doctor's chart said she should, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. And she had just told one of the most dangerous men in the city no without a second thought, because some things mattered more than being careful. She didn't throw the card away. She told herself, again, that it was only practical. She almost believed it a second time, too. He came back 3 days later, not with 4 men this time, alone, in the middle of the lunch rush, dressed down enough that if she hadn't already memorized his face, she might have mistaken him for any other businessman ducking in out of the cold. He took a stool at the counter instead of a booth, which surprised her, and ordered black coffee and eggs like he was any other regular. You're not subtle, Nora said, setting the coffee down in front of him. I wasn't trying to be. He wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking. I wanted to see if the diner survived my men's visit. Barely. Rick's been jumping every time the bell rings for 3 days. She nodded toward the kitchen, where the owner had, in fact, developed a habit of peering through the pass-through window every time the front door opened. You made an impression. I'll apologize to him personally, if that helps. It won't, but it's a nice thought. She set his eggs down a few minutes later and lingered, arms crossed on the counter, studying him with the same unflinching directness she'd used the first night. Why are you actually here, Mr. Castiglione? You didn't come back for the coffee. Adriano, he said, and you're right. I came back because I wanted to know if you'd change your answer with fewer witnesses. About Pharaoh? About the envelope? He finally took a sip of the coffee. Most people don't say no to that kind of money. I've spent a fair amount of my life around people who will sell almost anything for the right price, and I find I don't particularly respect any of them, even when their price is useful to me. So you came back to see if I'd sell out for less? I came back, Adriano said, because I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that you didn't. Nora studied him for a long moment, trying to find the angle, the hook, the thing men like him always seemed to be working toward, even when they claimed otherwise. She didn't find one. That unsettled her more than the 4 men and the envelope had. I'm not interested in whatever this is, she said finally. I've got rent due and a shift that starts in 10 minutes and absolutely no interest in getting tangled up in whatever business you're running. I'm not asking you to get tangled in anything. Then what are you asking? Adriano considered the question with more care than she expected. Nothing yet, he said. I think I'd just like to keep having coffee here, if that's allowed. It's a diner. Anyone's coffee is good here as long as they tip. Then I'll tip well, he said. And something in the corner of his mouth suggested he found the whole exchange more entertaining than he was letting on. Is that a yes? It's you can order coffee like anyone else, Nora said. Don't read too much into it. He came back the next day anyway. And the day after that. By the end of the first week, the diner regulars had started placing quiet bets on how long it would take Nora to finally tell the well-dressed stranger to get lost for good. By the end of the second week, most of those bets had been abandoned, because it had become clear that whatever was happening between the waitress and the man, everyone in the neighborhood had started calling, in hushed and slightly awed tones, the Castiglione fellow, wasn't the kind of thing that resolved itself quickly. He never brought gifts. He never pushed. He asked about her day, listened when she answered, and left exactly the kind of tip that suggested he'd noticed which bills were tightest for her that week, without ever once making it feel like charity. He learned, without being told directly, that she preferred the corner stool because it let her see the whole room, that she hummed old radio songs under her breath during slow afternoons, that she had a particular soft laugh she only let out when she'd genuinely forgotten to guard herself, and that it happened most often when he made some dry, understated joke that took her a beat too long to catch. When she told him, on the 9th day, that she needed him to stop coming because customers were starting to whisper, and she couldn't afford the kind of attention his reputation brought into a small business already hanging on by a thread, he nodded, said he understood, and didn't come back for 4 days. She found, to her own irritation, that she missed the coffee orders. He returned on the 5th day with a different approach entirely. Not customer this time, but a proposition, delivered plainly across the counter during a slow Tuesday afternoon. I have an event, he said. A charity dinner. Nothing to do with my other business. A legitimate foundation, hospitals, the kind of thing that actually does what it claims to do. I'd like you to come. Why? Because I think you'd hate every person in that room within 10 minutes, and I'd very much like to watch that happen. Nora laughed, despite herself. A real laugh, surprised out of her before she could stop it. That's the strangest reason anyone's ever given me for an invitation. It's an honest one, Adriano said. I'm tired of rooms full of people who agree with everything I say. I'd like to bring someone who won't. I don't own anything nice enough to wear to a place like that. Then wear what you have. I promise you it will still be the most honest thing anyone in that room is wearing all night. She said no 3 more times over the following week before, on the 4th ask, she finally said yes, not because his persistence had worn her down, but because she'd started, somewhere in those 2 weeks of quiet coffee orders and careful patience, to genuinely want to know more about the man who kept coming back, despite every reason she gave him not to. The night before the gala, Nora nearly canceled twice. She stood in front of her closet for the better part of an hour, staring at 3 dresses she'd owned for years. None of them purchased with a ballroom in mind, all of them plain and a little worn at the seams. She thought about every fitting room she'd ever stood in that hadn't carried her size, every wedding she'd attended in something borrowed and pinned because nothing off the rack ever quite fit right, every comment relatives had made at holiday dinners about second helpings that she'd learned, over the years, to absorb without flinching in front of anyone but her own bathroom mirror. She almost texted him to say she'd changed her mind. Instead, she pulled the dark green dress off its hanger, the one that fit best, the one that made her feel, on the rare occasions she wore it, like a person rather than an apology, and told herself that if a room full of strangers wanted to judge her for it, that said a great deal more about them than it ever would about her. She'd learned that lesson slowly and expensively over 29 years. She wasn't about to unlearn it for one night in a ballroom. The charity gala took place in a hotel ballroom draped in white and gold, exactly the kind of room Nora had spent her whole working life serving drinks in and never once been invited to stand inside as a guest. She wore the plain, dark green dress and felt every inch of her body being measured the moment she walked through the door, not by Adriano, who met her at the entrance with something that looked almost like relief on his face, but by the room itself, by the particular attention wealthy people paid to anyone who looked like they didn't belong. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People don't always mean that. I do." She looked around the glittering room, at the crystal and the careful laughter and the way conversations paused fractionally whenever someone new walked past. "This is exactly as insufferable as you promised. I told you." Something in his voice was warmer than she'd heard from him before. "Stay close to me and I'll make sure it's bearable." For the first hour, it almost was. He introduced her honestly, without embellishment or apology. "This is Nora. She works at a diner on Cedar Street. She makes the best coffee in the city and doesn't care who I am," and watched with something like satisfaction as she held her own in conversations with people who'd expected, based on nothing but the plainness of her dress, to be able to condescend to her without consequence. A retired judge asked her opinion on the foundation's new pediatric wing and seemed genuinely startled when her answer was sharper and more informed than his own. A city councilwoman complimented her earrings and meant it. For a little while, it felt almost easy. It fell apart around the second hour, when a woman in a silver gown detached herself from a cluster near the bar and made her way over with the deliberate glide of someone who'd been waiting for an opportunity all evening. "Adriano," the woman said warmly, before her eyes slid over to Nora with considerably less warmth. "And this must be the diner waitress. I've heard so much." "Priscilla," Adriano said, and something in the flatness of his voice suggested he already knew exactly where this conversation was headed and had no intention of enjoying it. "I have to say," Priscilla continued, ignoring the warning entirely, "it's refreshing seeing you step so far outside your usual type. Very charitable of you." Her eyes moved over Nora again, slower this time, cataloging, "though I imagine the appeal wears thin once the novelty does." Several nearby guests laughed quietly, the polite, complicit laugh of people who'd rather be entertained than embarrassed. Nora felt the old, familiar heat rise in her chest, the heat of every classroom, every dating app, every mirror that had ever told her she was too much of something and not enough of something else. "I'm sorry," Nora said evenly. "Were you saying something about type? Or were you just here to make sure everyone remembers you're wearing silver?" Priscilla's smile faltered. Adriano, beside her, made a sound that was very nearly a laugh, quickly smothered. "I was making an observation. You were making yourself feel bigger by trying to make me feel smaller," Nora said. "It's a pretty common move. I get it from customers who stick me on tips too. Usually it means they're compensating for something." She let the silence sit for a beat before adding, mildly, "Sweetie." The nearby guests laughed again, differently this time, genuinely, at Priscilla's expense instead of Nora's, and the woman in silver flushed a deep, blotchy red before excusing herself with as much dignity as she could gather and retreating toward the bar. Adriano looked at Nora with something between admiration and delight. "I should have warned you about Priscilla." "I've dealt with worse for less money," Nora said. "It's fine. It shouldn't have to be fine. You shouldn't have to defend yourself at a party I invited you to." "I didn't need you to defend me," Nora said, more gently now, some of the heat leaving her voice. "I've had a lifetime of practice. But thank you for wanting to." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, the particular look of a man recalculating, quietly, everything he thought he understood about what he wanted. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have spent a great deal of my life surrounded by people who either fear me or want something from me. And I have gotten very good at telling the difference between the two. I don't know what to call whatever this is with you, because it isn't either of those things. Maybe it's just people liking each other," Nora said. "It happens, even to men who own half the city." "Half," Adriano said, and this time his smile was real, unguarded, generous estimate. Word of what had happened at the gala moved through Adriano's world faster than either of them expected. Priscilla, it turned out, was not merely a socialite with sharp opinions. She was the daughter of a man Adriano did business with regularly, a supplier whose cooperation mattered more to the smooth running of certain operations than either Nora or Adriano had initially considered. 2 days after the gala, Adriano's oldest friend and closest advisor, a broad, graying man named Emiliano Vasquez, sat him down in the office above the docks and asked the question everyone else had been too careful to ask directly. "You understand what you did," Emiliano said, "letting that woman humiliate Priscilla Wren in front of half the city's donor class." "I understand Priscilla humiliated herself," Adriano said. "Nora just declined to let it happen quietly. That's not how her father's going to hear it. Then I'll explain it to him myself, the same way." Adriano didn't look up from the papers on his desk. "I'm not interested in apologizing for a woman defending her own dignity at a party I brought her to." Emiliano studied his old friend for a long moment, something between concern and reluctant curiosity in his expression. "You've never cared this much about a woman's opinion of herself before. What is it about this one?" Adriano set his pen down and considered the question honestly, the way he'd found himself considering a great many things honestly since the night of the envelope. "She doesn't want anything from me," he said finally. "Not money, not protection, not the things people usually want when they find out what I am. She just wants to be told the truth and treated like she matters. I don't think I've met anyone in 15 years who wanted so little and deserved so much more than they were getting. That's not an answer to my question. It's the only one I have." Emiliano let out a long breath, the sound of a man recalculating an old, familiar loyalty to account for something he hadn't planned for. "Wren's not going to let this go easily. He'll want something to smooth it over. A gesture, maybe a favor on the next shipment contract. Then he'll get a gesture that doesn't involve Nora apologizing for anything," Adriano said. "I'll handle Wren. You don't need to worry about that side of it." He did handle it, in the end, quietly, over the following 2 weeks, with the same patient, unhurried diplomacy he used for every difficult negotiation, smoothing over a supplier's wounded pride without ever once suggesting that the woman who'd wounded it had done anything wrong. It cost him more in favors and careful conversation than he let on to Nora, who never learned the details and would have been furious, in her practical way, to know how much trouble one sharp comment at a party had actually caused behind the scenes. The trouble that had brought them together in the first place resolved itself around the same time, quietly and with less violence than Nora had feared. Elias Farrow, the man who'd fled through the diner's alley door that first night, turned out to have stolen a modest sum from Adriano's legitimate charitable foundation, not from any criminal enterprise, out of desperation to cover a gambling debt that had nothing to do with the Castiglione organization at all. Adriano found him within the week, not through threats, but through the same patient methods he'd used on Nora. A quiet conversation, an offer of a payment plan instead of punishment, a debt repaid over 18 months instead of collected in blood. "You could have hurt him," Nora said, when Adriano told her how it had ended, sitting across from her at the diner counter on a slow Sunday morning. "Nobody would have questioned it." "I could have," Adriano agreed. "There was a time I would have, without thinking twice. But somewhere around the second week of drinking your coffee, I started asking myself whether every problem actually required the solution I'd always defaulted to, or whether I'd just never had a reason to consider anything gentler." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "You did that, without meaning to, just by saying no to an envelope of cash, and meaning it." Nora studied him for a long moment, the man who'd walked into her diner with 4 bodyguards and left, weeks later, having quietly rewritten his own instincts because a waitress had refused his money and told him the truth instead. "I never wanted to change you," she said. "I know," Adriano said. "That's precisely why it worked." Not everyone in Adriano's world had made peace with the change as easily as Emiliano, and, eventually, even Priscilla's father had. 3 weeks after the gala, one of Adriano's junior lieutenants, a sharp-tempered younger man named Cormac Reyes, no relation to any of the city's other Reyes families, but eager to be mistaken for one, decided the situation had gone on long enough without correction. He came to the diner alone on a Wednesday afternoon when it was mostly empty, and sat in the corner booth Elias Farrow had once fled from. Nora didn't recognize him, but she recognized the type immediately, the particular restless energy of a young man convinced he was owed more respect than he'd been given, looking for somewhere to spend it. "You're the waitress," he said, when she came to take his order. "The one Castiglione's been wasting his time on." "I'm the waitress who's going to take your order or ask you to leave," Nora said evenly. "Your choice." Cormac's mouth curled into something unpleasant. "You should know something about the man you've got wrapped around your finger. He didn't get where he is by being gentle. Every soft thing he's doing right now, letting a diner girl push him around in public, that's weakness. And weakness gets noticed, gets exploited." He leaned back in the booth. "I'd hate to see something happen to this place because his enemies figured out where his blind spot is." Nora didn't flinch, though something cold moved through her chest at the implied threat. She'd spent 3 years dealing with difficult customers, drunk regulars, men who thought a waitress's politeness was an invitation rather than a job requirement, and she'd learned, slowly, exactly how to hold her ground, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "You threatening me, or threatening him?" she asked. "Because it sounds like you're doing both badly. I'm giving you a warning. Then let me give you one back." She set both hands flat on the table, leaning in slightly. "I don't know what your position is in whatever business you're all running, and I genuinely don't care. But I'd think very carefully before I let a man like Adriano Castiglione find out one of his own people came into a place he cares about and threatened someone in it. Somehow, I don't think that's the kind of weakness you're imagining." Something flickered across Cormac's face, the first hint of doubt, the recognition of a miscalculation he hadn't quite let himself consider. He left without ordering, the bell above the door ringing sharp behind him. She told Adriano that evening, plainly, without drama, the same way she told him everything. His face went very still while she talked, the particular stillness she'd come to recognize as the thing that lived beneath his usual composure, not the absence of anger, but the deliberate, controlled containment of it. "I'll handle it," he said. "I already handled it. I know you did. I still need to handle the part where one of my own men thought it was acceptable to threaten you in your own place of work." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge underneath it Nora hadn't heard before, not directed at her but close enough that she understood, for the first time in weeks, exactly what kind of man she'd chosen to let into her life. "Nobody touches what matters to me." He knew that before he walked in there. He's going to be reminded of it very clearly. "I don't want you hurting him because of me." "I'm not going to hurt him," Adriano said. "I'm going to make sure he understands the difference between weakness and restraint, because apparently that distinction wasn't clear enough the first time I explained it to my organization." He looked at her steadily. "You handled yourself perfectly. That's not in question. What's in question is whether my own people understand that you're not a vulnerability to be exploited. That's on me to correct, not you." Cormac Reyes was gone from the organization within the week, not violently, as Nora had feared, but thoroughly, reassigned to work so far from the city's center that his name stopped coming up in conversation entirely. It was, Nora would later understand, exactly the kind of solution Adriano had been quietly practicing more of since the night of the envelope: firm without being cruel, final without being bloody. The kind of restraint that had never come naturally to him and that he'd built, deliberately, one difficult decision at a time, because a waitress on Cedar Street had taught him, without ever meaning to, that there was usually a better way than the one he'd always defaulted to. Meeting his mother happened almost by accident, on a Sunday 2 months after that first night in the pantry of rain and envelopes. Adriano had mentioned, in passing, that he usually had dinner with his mother once a week, a tradition he'd kept since his father's death years earlier, and Nora had made an offhand comment about how nice that sounded, the kind of ordinary family ritual her own life had lost the shape of somewhere in the exhaustion of the last 3 years. He'd gone quiet for a moment, then asked, with more hesitation than she'd ever heard from him, whether she'd like to come. Elena Castiglione turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who ran her son's kitchen with the same unquestioned authority he seemed to run everything else, and who looked Nora over, on arrival, with an assessing thoroughness that reminded her uncomfortably of every relative who'd ever measured her worth by the size of her plate. "So," Elena said, once they were seated, before Adriano had even finished pouring the wine, "you're the one who told my son no." "More than once," Nora said. Elena's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile. Good. He's been told yes his entire life. It's ruined more men than money ever has. She studied Nora a moment longer, then reached over and, without asking, put a second helping of pasta on her plate. Eat. You look like you work too hard and rest too little. I can tell these things. It was, Nora realized partway through the meal, the single kindest thing anyone had said to her about her own body in longer than she could remember. Not a comment on her size at all, but a simple, unguarded act of care. The kind she'd stopped expecting from strangers a long time ago. She likes you, Adriano said later, walking her down to the car. She doesn't put extra pasta on just anyone's plate, I noticed. That matters more than you might think. She was the only person who ever told me no and meant it. Before you. He looked at her, in the low porch light, something open and unguarded in his face that she'd only seen a handful of times since that first rainy night. I think that's part of why I couldn't stop coming back to that diner. You reminded me of the only person who'd ever made me better instead of just more powerful. Months later, the diner on Cedar Street was still exactly what it had always been. A small, unremarkable place with cracked vinyl booths and a bell above the door that needed oiling. Except now, it was also, on quiet Sunday mornings, the place where one of the city's most powerful men sat at the counter with his sleeves rolled up, drinking black coffee and letting a plus-size waitress tell him, without hesitation, exactly what she thought of his tie. Terrible, Nora said, refilling his cup. Truly, deeply terrible. Priscilla helped me pick it out. That explains everything. She set the pot down and leaned against the counter, watching him laugh. An easy, unguarded sound that still, after all these months, surprised her a little every time she managed to pull it out of him. You know, when you first put that envelope on my counter, I figured you for just another man who thought money could buy anything. I was, Adriano admitted. For a long time, it was true often enough that I never had a reason to doubt it. What changed? He reached across the counter. Not for the coffee this time, but for her hand, resting it gently over hers, the way he'd learned to do only after months of proving, patiently and without pressure, that he meant every gesture he offered. You did, he said simply. You told me no, and meant it, and I found out that was worth more to me than every yes I'd ever been given. Rick, wiping down the far end of the counter, pretended very hard not to be listening, the way he'd pretended not to listen to 100 similar conversations over the past several months, and failed, as always, to hide the small, satisfied smile that crossed his face whenever he caught the two of them like this. Unguarded, easy, entirely unremarkable in the way that only the truest kind of happiness ever managed to be. Outside, the rain that had started the whole thing had long since passed, and the city moved on around them the way cities always do, indifferent to the small, quiet reckonings happening inside any one of its million windows, unaware that somewhere on Cedar Street, a diner that had once nearly closed for good, now stayed busy every Sunday morning, full of regulars who'd long since stopped whispering about the well-dressed man at the counter, because by now, everyone in the neighborhood understood exactly what he was there for. He wasn't there for the coffee. He never had been.